Friends, colleagues, let me begin by firstly thanking the International Association for Student Affairs and Services and the North American Student Affairs Association, and of course the University of Stellenbosch, for inviting me to your global summit to share my thoughts on the evolution and challenges of the university in the 21st century and what it means for professional in the domain of student affairs and student services. It's a real pleasure to be here. And let me also take the opportunity as chair of USAf, the chair, as was said, of all the universities in South Africa, to welcome you to both South Africa and Stellenbosch, actually. It's a delightful place. It's truly a delightful place. You know, we currently live in a historic moment where the global education system holds enormous promise. Yet simultaneously, it's beset with enormous challenges emanating from a belief by many in the university community that that promise is completely wasted. This is a moment where there's a possibility of giving practical effect to the dictum that science has no boundaries. It's never been greater at any time in our history. Yet the possibility of it being realized is constrained by our national politics and bureaucracies, our resource constraints, our institutional and national rivalries, and the very inequality of our global academy. You know, I'm sure that we all collectively recognize, and it has been said so often in the 2 or 3 speeches earlier on, that in the 21st century we will not survive as a human species if we do not come together as a global citizenry and, as importantly, as a global academy. All of our challenges, inequality, terrorism, public health, climate change, renewable energies, are all transnational in character. And all of them require multinational teams that come together and begin to comprehensively tackle these challenges from a multiplicity of perspectives. This is why we have to learn to institutionally and individually come together. But we also need to do so thoughtfully. We also need to do so in ways, in calm, collected surroundings. Because if we do not do so thoughtfully, we may increase and reinforce the very inequalities of our world and thereby polarize our societies and our world even further. How we do that is an issue I will return to shortly. For now, however, I want to reflect a little on how universities and the higher education system globally can assist in addressing inequality and thereby facilitating the emergence of more inclusive societies that are less socially and politically polarized than at present. For us to succeed in addressing inequality, we need to be able to do 2 distinct things. First, we need to provide sufficient numbers of students from poor and marginalized communities with access to the best universities and institutions of our societies and our world. I want to say this again. We need to provide sufficient numbers of students from poor and marginalized communities with access to the best universities and institutions in our society and in our world. The second is we need to produce sufficient numbers of high-quality graduates in the professions required by our societies and economies so that scarcity does not lead to the undue escalation of their remuneration. One of the most powerful books in the last 2-3 years, there's a book written by a guy called Thomas Piketty, a French economist who taught in the United States for a while, MIT I think it was, but is now based in Paris, in Sorbonne. And what he says is it's very rare that an economist writes a book and it becomes a New York bestseller. There's something about our world that shows something seriously wrong when people start reading an economist around the world. But the point is, what he says is one of the biggest challenges in our world today is the levels of inequality. And what he suggests is the levels of inequality are reaching levels that last approximated in 1913. And what was followed by that was 2 world wars. And effectively what he suggests is part of the causal factors in that is the escalation of salaries of those people in high sought after professions and in managerial positions in the global economy. And he says it's one of the biggest drivers, as is 1 or 2 other things. One is the price of stocks and bonds and assets. But what he says is it's one of the big drivers, if you like, of inequality. And part of that has to do with the very nature of scarcity. And if you start producing sufficient numbers of high quality graduates required by our society and economies, we begin to protect against the excesses that this might lead to in those categories of in the remuneration in those categories of skills, and ultimately in the very inequality of our societies and our economies. You see, doing both, however, is easier said than done. And currently, we're undergoing in South Africa huge student protests, as was said earlier, precisely on these issues. And what I want to do is have the temerity of, if you like, reflecting a little on this as it may cast light on the challenges at hand. I say temerity in a lot of ways, because in a lot of ways as a Vice-Chancellor, I'm immersed in these protests. And so I'm not an independent, neutral analyst by any means. I'm somebody who's a participant. And however, I do think that we need a plurality of voices and a plurality of perspectives on these student struggles. And it's important to reflect on them. Now, you may, of course, ask why at a global summit should I reflect on a South African struggle to understand global challenges? It's a legitimate question. My answer is that South Africa is merely a microcosm of our world. It is perhaps the most acute manifestation of the challenges that confront us all in our world. And its struggles are essentially a harbinger of what is likely to confront all of you in the months and years ahead. You know, I was in New York at the Mellon Foundation a couple of months ago, speaking to the board, partly because funders are freaked out by what's happening in South African higher education. So I've had to repeatedly fly up to speak to boards to say, don't worry, relax, calm down. This is not the end of the world. But in that conversation, I spoke to a member of the board of the Mellon Foundation. And she said to me something fairly important, and I don't think we realize this. The United States has had more social protests on its campuses in 2015 than it did in 1968. Now, of course, it doesn't have the same political flavor, or even for now, the same political impact. But who is to suggest that that is not something that is going to emerge in the months and years ahead? After all, think about the social movement, Black Lives Matter. Think about the phenomenon of Bernie Sanders in a presidential election in the United States. Think about the problem of 1.3 trillion in university debt in the United States alone, larger than credit card debt. And you will realize that young people in the United States are extremely unhappy with the political and, dare I say, the economic system. Similarly, in the UK, Brexit, its poll and its outcome, highlighted the fact that young British voters are alienated from the decisions of their parents. The same is true in much of Europe, Asia, Latin America, Africa, and of course the Middle East, where you had the Arab Revolt, where an intergenerational conflict is playing itself out most acutely on the campuses of universities. Partly because at one level, this is where young, relatively privileged people exist. 2, these are safe spaces. And 3, they can experiment with ideas. And so, most acutely, the intergenerational conflict, some say war, that is underway in our world, is currently playing itself out. South Africa's struggle on its universities is merely the most acute manifestation of a global tension that is playing out in all of our societies. So the question then becomes to return to the student protests in South Africa. The outset, let me state that I think that the struggle of students is a noble one. Essentially, it's a struggle against the high costs of university education and the alienation of mainly black students in historically white universities. So, how did it emerge? It seems to me that what effectively happened in about 20 years ago, as South Africa entered its democratic transition, government decided to expand access to higher education. And effectively, we grew the higher education system from something like 420,000 students in 1994 to effectively 1.1 million students in 2014. More than doubled. But throughout this period, as we expanded access to higher education, the per capita subsidy, which all of you will realize from all of your societies, the per capita subsidy from the state began to decline. And as the per capita subsidy of the state began to decline, vice-chancellors, bureaucrats like me and my predecessors, effectively began to increase fees, often in double digits. And when you do this for a period of 15 or 20 years, you effectively have a situation where you price out higher education, not only outside the hands of the working class, but outside the hands of also the middle classes. Effectively, that's the first big challenge. Second, as we expanded access to these universities, what we didn't begin to come to terms with as institutions is that as our student base diversified, the universities themselves had to change. What we expected the students to do is to change for the university rather than enabling the university to begin to acclimatize to the change of the students themselves. And the second struggle blew up. That second struggle blew up about 50 kilometers away at the University of Cape Town, but it very easily spread to all of our universities. It's gravitated around a statue of a man called Cecil John Rhodes, a man who played a phenomenal role, and I don't mean phenomenon as a positive term, a phenomenal role in the industrialization of Southern Africa. And he had donated that piece of land that is now the University of Cape Town to start off this university. And at its center was the statue of Cecil John Rhodes. And after 20 years, at one level quite astonishingly, because black students walked past our feet for 20 years, but at some point it became the magnet for disaffection of largely black students at historically white universities. And effectively it became a struggle to remove that statue. But it was not about the statue. It was about the culture. It was about the name. It was about the feeling that I feel alienated from the very institution where I'm supposed to be at home. And that struggle is something that has begun to manifest itself in South Africa. Now, both struggles are not unique to South Africa. Black Lives Matter is essentially spreading throughout campuses of the United States precisely because of that very alienation that black and minority students feel in historically white and sometimes even historically black universities in the United States. But that same thing is playing itself out in parts of Europe, parts of the United States. The big struggles around roads emerged in Oxford. There is a battle happening at the University of Harvard about its crest, and how its crest represents the imagery of a slave owner. And is that legitimate in the context of a university that claims to want to represent the cosmopolitan world of the 21st century? These are serious, serious questions, and it seems to me they're not South African questions. They're fundamentally questions of our world, and most acutely they're manifested in the struggles in our campuses itself. So the two things I want to say is that I do think that these struggles are noble struggles. For 20 years, I've been a political scientist. I've written about South Africa and issues of transformation. And I've for years, decades actually, been predicting that we are heading for a social explosion in our university campuses. Little did I expect that when the social explosion happened, that I would be on the side of having to manage the social explosion. For long periods of time, I had imagined that I would be on the barricade itself rather than having to manage the barricades. So it's an interesting emotional coaster ride, if you like, at this moment. But as much as I think that these struggles are noble and important, I do think that one has to ask strong questions about the tactics of the student struggles themselves. And I've said this publicly. I worry about sometimes within factions of the movement, the language of racism. I worry about the politics of duplicity, where you say one thing in private and you say another in public. I've been accused for the last 3-4 weeks of not having met students. Yet out of the 7-8 factions of the student movement, I've probably met 6 to 7. Every one of them quietly, and every time they meet me, they say, please don't say publicly that we're meeting you to engage on these issues. I have got on my cell phone somebody saying to me, Habib must fall. No. Or you are a manifestation of neoliberalism. And then they send me an SMS saying, we don't really mean it, you know. It's just the politics that has to play itself out. I do worry about that politics of duplicity. Because one of the fundamental mistakes of our existing political elite is it says one thing in private and does another in public. And it is precisely if you continue with this politics of duplicity, you will repeat the very mistakes of our political past. I worry about the politics of spectacle, where effectively what you want to do is engage in the crowd, but use the crowd as a mechanism of silencing rather than opening up and democratization itself. You know, it's a politics of the far right, by the way. If you do research on strategies and tactics, far right parties have always been able to dominate, not because they won the majority support of citizens in the society, but the ability to create in the crowd the politics of spectacle and use it as a means to silence others. If you want to understand this, understand the rise of Hitler in the 1920s in Germany. He never had a majority. He simply used the crowd as a means and the politics of spectacle to silence the majority itself. And I worry about this unthoughtful, simply adoption of tactics from the right in a desire to advance what is essentially a social justice struggle. I worry about the propensity to violence. And in the South African context, what has begun to happen is this propensity for arson. R1 billion worth of educational infrastructure has been burnt at universities, and nobody can still explain to me, how is it that you say, I'm advancing the cause of free education, and yet you burn the very infrastructure that is going to be required for that free education? And I worry, actually, about effectively intolerance in the movement itself. And I worry about the failure to understand trade-offs. I know of no social justice struggle anywhere in the world where you suddenly achieve the outcome of that social justice across overnight. It is always a struggle for reforms, progressive reforms, I grant you, but reforms that slowly can be consolidated and further consolidated to an outcome that is largely acceptable to the majority of society. And so, while I understand and actually respect the nobility of the struggle, it is precisely why when the struggle emerged last year, in October 2015, the Fees Must Fall exploded at Wits University. When it exploded at Wits University, I went there. We were supposed to send in police at that time. And the students said, we'd like to see the Vice-Chancellor. And I said, let's go. And I walked in and I spent 24 hours overnight in the concourse of what is now Solomon Mahlangu House. And I did that even though we had security, and security said, should we take you out? And I said, no, let's see this through, because there is a legitimacy to the struggle. But as much as there is that legitimacy, if you truly believe in the legitimacy and the nobility of the ideal of Fees Must Fall, then you must have the political courage to confront it when its tactics are not conducive to the realization of that struggle itself. And so it's been a difficult time. You know, you could be a Vice-Chancellor who shuts up in his office, keeps quiet, doesn't raise these issues, and, if you like, float below the radar. But it seems to me that if you recognize this, the right of the struggle and the nobility of the struggle, then you must have the courage of effectively reflecting on the tactics of the movement itself, even though you may be compromised by the fact that you are a participant in that very, very struggle. How to fix this system is something that I do want to reflect on, because I think it's something that is going to be pertinent to how we move forward. I said that one of the movement's challenges, its tactics, is about trying to understand trade-offs. See, even if you are able to, it will cost you 50 billion in South Africa, additional, to free higher education in its entirety, not only tuition, but tuition, accommodation, and subsistence. The question that you have to ask is, 50 billion here, what about the TVET colleges? What about the vocational colleges? If you add them, you're looking at 80 billion. And even if you found a solution to the 80 billion, and I'll talk to that in a minute, the question you have to ask is, why are you putting 80 billion in higher education in TVET colleges for 1.1 million people when you got 4 million people who are unemployed at home? Why are you putting 80 billion in higher education and not funding early childhood development that is completely, and all the research shows that if you want to have inclusive economies, actually you catch children between 4 and 7. Now I'm not using this as an example to say we shouldn't free higher education. But I am saying that we need to start thinking about hard trade-offs. And that those trade-offs should not be the preserve of a Vice-Chancellor or a cabinet minister. It should be the preserve of society as a whole. Society as a whole must say, these are the monies we've raised, and these are the choices we're making with these trade-offs for the next period of time. That is a right for society as a whole. The question is, how do you fund this? Now, I want to be able to say, because I'm speaking to a global audience, each of our solutions has to be contextually specific. We can't simply use the example of South Africa or the United States and apply it to Taiwan or China or India. They have to be grounded in contextual specificities. But if you were going to ask me, how would you start this conversation? My answer, as Habib, not as Vice-Chancellor now, would be, as a general rule, tax the rich and put the money in higher education. The question is this immediately likely? And my answer is, probably not. I wish it were. I wish we could do it immediately. But if you were to do it, and I've just looked at a proposal put forward by the student movement, and much of the document is a 7-page document, the first 5 pages I entirely agreed. And then when they made the practical proposals, I began to ask, is this feasible? Because in the individual demands, they were not wrong. Increase tax rates of the corporate sector by 2%, we could do that. Increase wealth tax by 2%, we could do that. Increase the skills levy by 1% to 3%, we could do that. But when you added them all up, tax increases in the rich would have jumped 15%. Now, as much as I'd like to hammer the rich, I'm also cognizant of the fact that you have schemes like tax avoidance. You can implode an economy. And even though you increase the taxes by 15%, but if your GDP contracts by 20%, you've effectively lost out. You've not got more money, you've effectively got less. And so one of the things, as much as I would like to make some suggestions on how you fix a system, you have to operate on the principle of the world that exists now, rather than the world you wish existed. It's something that progressives need to learn about. You operate from a world that exists now, not that the world that you wish existed. And so effectively, what I've suggested is we need to start thinking of progressive reforms of a system and how to move forward. I can't see that actually. What does it say? 5, okay. And so I think we need to think through how we move forward. And that's something that we're going to do. And so one of the things we're thinking about is free higher education is perfectly possible for the poor. They should be granted, and a grant system should be made available. The rich should pay for now. And possibly we need to create a financing mechanism for the middle classes. But we need to be aware of the American problem, which is suddenly you could land up with a 1.3 trillion debt. And so what you need to start doing is, as you set up this system now, you need to progressively move towards a greater subsidy system and a greater freeing up of higher education, as by tying it to growth rates in the economy and through an expansion of the tax base of the economy. So when your economy is growing in South Africa at 1%, you might say we'll have this regime. But when it runs to 4%, you say we start bringing in, freeing up the middle class. And when it runs at 7%, you start freeing up the upper sections of the middle classes. That you effectively put a mechanism in now, but you tie it to growth rates in the economy and the expansion of the tax base, so that it begins to become a progressive continuation series of reforms that begin to address and the freeing up of higher education. Because nobody can deny this. Free higher education, free basic education have enormous inclusive development outcomes. And if you want to create a more inclusive world order, then that is important. I've got about 3 minutes. I'm going to say 2 other things, which I think is important before I leave. One is on internationalization, so give me 2 minutes more. And one is on what I'm going to have the temerity to say what I think is important for student practitioners. The first on internationalization If we're going to set these two things up, which is providing access to higher education, and increasingly ensuring that we provide quality graduates from the higher education system, those two things will have an important impact on creating a less unequal global order. But it also, something else is required, and the very nature of how we internationalize. Because increasingly, if we're seeing ourselves as a global community, as coming together as a global community, then how we do internationalization is important. And effectively, there are two models that are currently at play. The first model is a model that says, what we're going to do is take good institutions and replicate them with campuses around the world. It's a model of internationalization where you take, I don't know, the equivalent of a Cambridge or an Oxford or a Yale or New York University and establish campuses in Dubai and Malaysia and wherever else you think it's appropriate. The problem with that is it weakens the local institutions. There are some horrendous cases where the international institution in Malaysia is using the graduate students of the local institution and charging 10 times more in dollars. That's not internationalization. It's what previously people call, and I'm going to be provocative here, imperialism. Right. If you truly want an internationalization that is committed to social equality, to inclusion, then what you need to do is create students and scholars from across our globes to come together, to jointly fundraise, to jointly determine the resourcing, and to jointly undertake research and teaching as part of what I call a global academy of commons. And if we begin to pioneer a global academy of commons, of university scholars, students, practitioners coming together and saying, we're a common community across our national, across our institutional boundaries. What you effectively can do is create one of the foundational elements of a common global citizenship. And so it seems to me that we really need some heavy interrogation, some deliberation on what internationalization means and what forms of internationalization facilitate the inclusive outcomes we want and others that undermine that. And that's a conversation we're not having sufficiently in our institutions. What does all of this mean for student affairs and student service practitioners? It seems to me there are three issues that you need to worry about. First, if we are moving into a period characterized by a resurgence of student struggles, then it's important to know that the university community is going to become fractured. It's going to become fractured within the student communities, and I see it on my campuses. People who want to struggle, people who want to go back to class, people who want to graduate, people who want to do huge tensions. But it's also the fractures and fissures that emerges within the academic community and between the academic community and the student community, and definitely the alumni. And if that is the case, student practitioners have to be at the forefront of trying to learn to mitigate that fracturing that is happening in the university community, but also beginning to learn how to provide answers for the challenges that exist. The second is that student community needs to, again, we need to understand if the suggested internationalization strategy is to be realized, where we bring scholars and students together in a socially inclusive, progressive internationalization, then what you have to think about is that our communities are going to become far more diverse. They're going to become far more cosmopolitan. And then issues around the culturation project, the institutional culture, the environment must be conducive to a cosmopolitan but diverse community itself. And again, student practitioners have to be at the heart of that. They have to be at the very heart of what the naming of a institution is. What are its symbols? What are its cultures? How do you bring together university communities in ways that allow them to maintain their difference, that celebrate that difference, but simultaneously allow them to become part of a coherent university community? And then third, as so many of you said, in a university you learn as much outside the classroom as you do within the classroom. And if you're going to learn as much outside the classroom, you learn principles of social justice, you learn principles of solidarity, and you learn how to simultaneously be a citizen of your nation and a citizen of the world. These are issues that all of you are going to be at the forefront of in the coming decade or two. And those are the questions that you need to truly address. So, let me come to an end. You live, or you're visiting a country which bequeathed to the world that icon of peace, Nelson Mandela. If you want to honor his memory, then you should take very seriously the mandate, the character of his entire life. If you want to pay homage to Mandela, or even to Desmond Tutu, you need to establish one of the foundational elements of a universal citizenship, a cosmopolitan citizenship, or what we call in South Africa, an Afropolitan citizenship, in which you're simultaneously African and human, European and human, Asian and human, North American and human, South American and human. It is only through this construction of being a citizen of the nation and a citizen of a world, through this construction of being an equal and egalitarian human community, that we will truly survive as a human species in the 21st century. And on our campuses, you will be at the forefront of that struggle. Thank you very, very much.